This is a comparative piece on Jane Holland's Boudicca series. Holland is an English poet, and this came out in 2006. And the more I read it, the more I started to think about the story of Philomela and Procne. So this has turned into a reception paper that's also a comparative paper. Boudicca, the ancient Icenian Queen, who led her people against the Roman invasion of Britain in AD 60 or 61, is an integral symbol in the collective English psyche. Her story, as taught to children in schools and inscribed on the Norfolk landscape, is one of freedom and resistance within humiliation, exploitation, and colonisation. Forever colonised in most representations, first by Rome, then by artists, and even gamers, she is often badly executed. But under Jane Holland's poetic spell, she is truthfully repellent, a sexual brute who has been brutalised sexually, a flawed, violent psychopath, recalcitrant victim of war, and one of war's great victimisers. This study examines Holland's violated and violating Boudicca in dialogue with the reception of classical sexual violence and seeks to prompt debate, to put forward the question, what is at stake for scholars of classical reception in reading and writing about rape? Holland's Boudicca is embedded in a collection called Boudicca & Co., released in 2006. The collection is divided into 4 parts. The first part is on travel. The second is a series of personal poems. The third, a series of observational poems. And the focus of this paper, the fourth, is on Boudicca. Part 4, the Boudicca series, is made discrete from the previous parts, not only because it is given a title where the others are not, but also because Holland includes a biographical vignette on its namesake. The series takes the form of autobiography from the perspective of Boudicca, who narrates the story of her own life from birth to death, as well as biography from the perspective of Holland, who writes the narrative of Boudicca's life from birth to death. Holland thereby plays with the fiction that is poetry, as well as the truth that is poetry, unconsciously or consciously making fiction twice as true as fact. In the 22 poems that comprise the Boudicca series, Holland narrates her protagonists using the framework of a life cycle, which characterised several individual poems in part 1. She begins with Boudicca's birth in the opening poem, moves to her marriage to Prasutagus, then to motherhood, the death of Boudicca's husband, and finally Boudicca's renewal as a leader of her people in the 5th. After these pivotal works, the scene is set for a sub-series on Boudicca's battles against the Romans, which leads to the closing of the life cycle trope with the final poem called Suicide, depicting Boudicca's death. In addition to this chronological sequencing, the series is characterised by first-person narration, feminism, the abject, the carnivalesque, and the spectacular, and in this way is arguably closer to Ovid's Metamorphoses than one would initially expect. Holland's own feminism can be situated within the historical context of Third Wave, marked by the rejection of grand narrative and rigid sexual politics in preference for postmodern contradictions and malleable liminal positions. However, her Boudicca is closer to radical second-wave feminists with shades of Valerie Solanas, best known for attempting to shoot Andy Warhol and for authoring the Scum Manifesto. The tension between political messaging and meaning, exacerbated by the abject, the carnivalesque, and the spectacular, is what makes the Boudicca series a poetic offspring of Ovid's Metamorphoses, a text that also traverses dangerous terrains, provoking multiple and oppositional readings of its treatment of rape and violence. Arguably, the most terrifying event in the Metamorphoses is the story of Tereus, Procne and Philomela in Book 6. Although this tale competes with those of Actaeon in Book 3, Pentheus also in Book 3, and Marsus in Book 6 for sheer literary horror, its manifestation of the abject, carnivalesque and spectacular makes it a useful comparison piece to Holland's Boudicca. The pivotal scenes that embody all three characteristics of Holland's series are the removal of Philomela's tongue, lines 555 to 560, so shocking that it provokes a rare Ovidian parentheses vix ausim credere at line 561, Procne's crazed thirst for revenge at lines 611 to 619, and the murder, cooking and consumption of Itys at lines 636 to 654. The abduction, imprisonment and rape of Philomela culminate in one spectacular action, her ultimate humiliation and degradation, the violent removal of her tongue, which physically silences her forever. And I quote, "That man, being indignant and calling upon the name Father all the time and striving to speak, the tongue having been clamped with pincers, removed with the cruel sword, the last root of the tongue quivers, the tongue itself lies, and trembling murmurs on the dark earth. And, as the tail of a mutilated snake usually jumps about, it twitches and on dying seeks the footprints of its mistress." Ovid hurls Philomela and Tereus into a world in which reason and order decompose into frightening confusion and chaos, to quote Charles Segal. The world of the carnivalesque is one of heightened subversion, destruction of boundaries, and in the Metamorphoses, horror. The objection and the spectacular are meticulously crafted by Ovid. The spondees in lines 555 and 556 evoke resistance or struggle. The choice of three participles in lines 555 to 556 create confusion as to who is being indignant, calling out, and striving to speak, while the use of the alliteration in line 556 enhances disruption and surprise, the first two of the three alliterative words preventing a liquid flow owing to their hard consonants, and the third ending the line and revealing the delayed object of attention, lingua. The focalization of lines 557 to 560 aligns with the narratorial invasion of Philomela's mouth, right down to the close-up of the last root of the tongue described as quivering, panning down to the tongue itself that trembles and murmurs to the dark earth. This is both ironic and macabre. Peter Toohey notes the foreshadowing of the cruel surrealist humour of these lines at, for example, line 471, which I translate, it's not on the handout. He added tears as though she had ordered these as well. And line 570, and I quote, "And he mourned the fate of a sister not yet mourned." He suggests that the characteristic of the Ovidian ludic at work in this story, underscored by extravagance, introduces an element of fantasy and of the heartless humour that allows us to distance the art of the Metamorphoses from life. I'm not quite sure if I agree with that. At lines 611 to 619, Ovid introduces the retribution meted out by the sisters by the evocation of the crazed state of Procne. Quote, "This is not a time for tears," she says, "but either for steel, or if you have anything that can overcome steel, in every form of impiety. I, twin sister, have readied myself. I will either incinerate the royal palace with torches and dispatch its architect, Tereus, to the middle of the flames, or the tongue and the eyes and the bodily parts that took shame from you I will carry away by steel, or through 1,000 wounds I will expel his criminal soul. I am ready for any kind of greatness. What it might be as yet, I am uncertain. Procne's rage and burgeoning, unpredictable thirst for revenge equates with Tereus's uncontrollable lust. Regarding capacity for outrage, sacrilege, brutality, and abominations, woman matches man in Ovid's account. The imitatio of Euripides' Medea in Procne's threats to burn down the house of Tereus, with him in it, amplify the emotions of the speech, as do the fantasies of mutilation, one of which is matched to the crime that has stimulated the revenge, the mutilation of Philomela's tongue. The irrational ablative of line 6:117 attests to the distraught state of Procne's mind. The uncertainty of the last line of this passage opens the door to the ultimate act of revenge, which is set in train in the line immediately following it, line 6:20, in which Itys appears before his mother. The murder of Itys, again redolent with echoes of Euripides' Medea, is spectacular in its abjection. And with no delay, she dragged Itys, just like a tigress from the Ganges, a suckling baby of the hind, through the dark forests. And when they reached a remote part of the lofty house, with him both holding out his hand and now seeking his own fate and crying out, "Mother, mother," and reaching for her neck with a sword Procne struck inside the side by which the breastbone is attached. Nor did she turn away her face. Sufficient for the doom of that boy was just the one wound. Philomela severed the throat by means of steel. And the members, still living and retaining something of the life force, they cut into pieces. A part then bubbles up in bronze cauldrons, part crackles on roasting spits. The inner chambers ooze with putrid gore. To these dining tables the wife summons an unknowing Tereus. The deliberate, awe-inspiring mastery of poetic craft is nowhere better demonstrated in the Metamorphoses than here. Ovid accentuates the cinematography at line 636. He luxuriates over the long syllables of line 642. He revels in the choice of the present tense. The action is happening now. He returns to Philomela's semi-live tongue in the picture of the child's members still living at 644, a deliberate image designed to facilitate the horror of the picture of mother and aunt hacking at a not yet dead body. But Ovid outdoes himself at lines 645 to 46, quite possibly the epitome of his celebration of violence as entertainment. Here the abject reigns supreme, manifested in taboo, ritual, the grotesque, and a humour of the absurd. Tereus's consumption of Itys is crowned with Procne's punchline, intus habes quem poscus. You have inside what you seek. If Ovid's themes of the ramifications of lust, anger, and revenge were penned by a fairer hand, you would have Jane Holland's Boudicca series, and you would have Not Exactly a Virgin and Headless Woman, the two poems I'll now address. Not Exactly a Virgin. I married Prasutagus in the spring. We did it the old-fashioned way, slaughtered everything and feasted till May. I remember blossom falling. He was the stag and I was the hind, running wild before him. Prasutagus was a good man and a better king. I let him catch me, push me to the earth, laughing. There was no pain that day or what followed. In those days I was less fussy what I put in my mouth. I wasn't exactly a virgin, but I hadn't yet seen a woman's throat ripped out for refusing to swallow. Boudicca's power is achieved in part by the first-person voice. She tells the tale here, as in all the poems in the series. Boudicca marries Prasutagus, not the other way round. Like Ovid's tale, food, eating, and expressly what one puts in one's mouth is the focus of Holland's abject. This is introduced at lines 2 to 3, where Boudicca describes a marriage feast, which, like the marriage ceremony of Tereus and Procne, also opens poetic proceedings and presages death. The uncanniness and unpredictability of the carnivalesque are cleverly managed and manipulated by Holland. The marriage feast of stanza 1 is followed by a landscape of seemingly perpetual spring at stanza 2 and 3. Ovid also marks time in his story through reference to seasons, namely autumn. The mirage, however, is disrupted at stanza 4 by Boudicca's reflective statements, "There was no pain that day, or in what followed." The implication that pain is to come is developed by the lines that follow, "In those days I was less fussy what I put in my mouth." From the image of the marriage feast that opens the poem to the allusion to oral sex, Holland has paced her poetic timing to lead into the punchline of the last stanza. Therein, Boudicca abruptly contrasts the carnivalesque of the marriage ceremony and the conjugal pleasures that follow with the carnivalesque ceremonies of the battlefield that ritualistically replace the passionate bride who performs fellatio with the image of a raped woman refusing to suck off a soldier. Like Philomela, whose tongue is cut out because she refuses to submit to rape, Boudicca's nameless woman has her throat ripped out for refusing to swallow. The second poem, Headless Woman. They were never expecting us. Gates were always wide open. We ate Romans for breakfast and raped the livestock. It all got mildly out of hand after Camulodunum. Kids murdered, mass graves, stinking behind villas. Once I slipped on a brain in the road, decapitated owner, half lying, half sitting against the ruins of her house. I couldn't help laughing, she looked so comical, feet dragged in the dirt, spare head grinning. This poem is set during the battles that Boudicca led against the Romans. The theme of abject consumption is highlighted. At line 2, the image of gates were always wide open alludes to a gaping mouth and mocks the Romans' sense of safety. This mockery is reinforced by the line that follows, "We ate Romans for breakfast," a spectacular image of cannibalism couched in colloquialism. The surreal scene is further evoked in Boudicca's boast that they raped the livestock, and together the lines overturn the masculine invader's ethos, rape the women, eat the food. The humour of the abject carnivalesque is evident in her wry, psychologically disconnected observations at lines 5 to 6. It all got mildly out of hand after Camulodunum. Kids murdered, mass graves, stinking behind villas. The transformative effects of violation, abuse, and violent humiliation, which obsessed Ovid in his story, are dramatised by Holland in her tragic comedy. The abolition of what makes one human, engendered through acts of rape and mutilation, results not only in disconnection, but also in a state of sadistic psychological anarchy. Neither poet judges the acts of their protagonists. They are too invested in engaging their readers in poetic fantasy, evidenced by the sudden, godless metamorphoses of Ovid's characters into birds, and the forced suicide of Holland's protagonist, whose last words, and I quote, "Nothing else, just good British dirt, and closing my mouth on it," ends her life and the collection. For Ovid's women, a flight into freedom, and for Holland's Boudicca, the pseudo-sexual embracing of her first love, her home, her soil. Both operate in an amoral artistic space, yet modern reception of these works and the authors are tied into a gendered binary. It is assumed that Holland's work is anti-rape and pro-women, and Ovid's is the reverse. In Amy Richland's influential essay, Reading Ovid's Rapes, she defines the metamorphoses as metapornography. This definition creates a clash of genres that destabilises the text and situates the reader in a place and state of moral uncertainty. She argues that a text such as the Metamorphoses, and expressly its version of the myth of Philomela and Procne, needs to be rescued and reclaimed by feminists. She strongly objects to rape as a joke in Ovid's poetry and suggests that feminists appropriate and blow up the canon. But what if Ovid were a woman, a modern liberated female poet? Holland, as a female and feminist poet, has appropriated the meta-pornography of Ovid, and in so doing has not blown up the canon, but rescripted it. Holland's work also serves to reposition Ovid's as her gender and politics distance the art of the Metamorphoses from life. In addition, comparison prompts debate and fresh perspectives when writing on classical reception and rape, and begs a return to the question, what is at stake for scholars of classical reception in reading and writing about rape? Just as feminists have battled for generations to refute assumptions about women and men, scholars must distance the art of Ovid from gendered and societal assumptions about the man Ovid. For Ovid is also a woman in the guise of Jane Holland in this instance, and this fantastical reality calls for a revisioning of the scholarly treatment of poetry, rape, misogyny, violence, feminism, ethics, and classical reception. Thank you.